My grandmother set down her fork at her 40th anniversary dinner, smiled at me across the candles, and asked how I was liking the house on Birchwood Lane. I smiled back and said it was wonderful, because that's what you do when you don't want to embarrass someone you love in front of 40 guests. I had never once set foot on Birchwood Lane. I didn't even know the address existed until that exact sentence left her mouth. Welcome to Sweet Payback Stories. Tonight's story begins with a birthday gift that looked like it simply fell through, until one quiet dinner question revealed it had never fallen through at all. It had just gone to someone else. My name is Leah Whitmore. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation clinic outside Columbus, the kind of job where you spend your days teaching stroke patients how to hold a spoon again. Patient, unglamorous work that rarely makes anyone rich, but makes you good at noticing small changes other people miss. I want you to remember that about me as this story goes on, because noticing small changes turned out to be the exact skill that unraveled 6 years of my own family's careful arrangement. 6 years ago, my grandmother, Iris, had a health scare, a fall that put her in the hospital for a week and scared all of us badly enough that we started having the kinds of conversations families have when they suddenly remember nobody lives forever. A few weeks after she came home, she called me into her sunroom, the one with the yellow curtains she's had since before I was born, and patted the cushion beside her on the wicker love seat. "Sit down, sweetheart," she said, and I remember thinking she looked smaller than she had before the fall, though her voice was as steady as ever. "I want to do something for you while I still can. Something that actually changes your life instead of just sitting in an envelope for later." She told me she wanted to buy me a house. I cried in that sunroom, genuinely, the kind of crying that surprises you with how much of it there is, and she reached over and patted my hand the way she'd done since I was small. "Don't worry about the details," she said. "Your father's going to help handle the paperwork. He's good with that kind of thing, and I trust him to manage it properly. You just be patient and let the grown-ups sort it out." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, the way I've had to sit with it for 6 years since. Let the grown-ups sort it out. I was 26 years old, already licensed, already working full-time, and somehow, in my own family's mind, still categorically a child when it came to anything involving real money. I didn't question it at the time. Why would I have? My father had always handled the family's larger financial matters, the mortgage refinancing, my grandfather's old business paperwork before he passed, and it felt, in that moment, like a natural extension of a role he'd always occupied. I went back to my one-bedroom apartment that night and told myself my whole life was about to change. Weeks passed, then months. Every time I asked my father how things were progressing, he had a new reason for the delay: financing complications, a title issue, a seller who kept dragging their feet on repairs. I believed every single explanation, because I had no reason not to, and because the alternative, that my own father might be lying to me directly, wasn't a thought I had any framework for holding at 26. Around the 8-month mark, the explanations simply stopped coming as often, and eventually the subject faded out of our conversations entirely, the way disappointing things do when nobody wants to be the one who brings them back up. I assumed, quietly, privately, that the sale had genuinely fallen through, that my grandmother's generous idea had run into some real-world obstacle none of us had anticipated, and that raising it again would only embarrass her. I let it go. I let it go for 6 years. The anniversary dinner was held at the same country club function room my parents always rent for milestone occasions. White tablecloths, a string quartet my mother insists on even though nobody under 60 pays it any attention, candles in tall glass hurricanes down the center of every table. I was seated between my sister Cassidy and her fiancé, half listening to the toasts, watching my father laugh a little too loudly at something his brother said, when my grandmother, 3 seats down in a dress the same soft blue as her eyes, set her fork against her plate with a small, deliberate clink and looked directly at me. "Leah, honey," she said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, pausing the whole conversation around her the way she always did without seeming to try. "How are you liking the house? Is the light in that back bedroom as good as I remembered from the listing photos?" I felt the whole left side of my body go very still. My mother's water glass, mid-refill, stopped exactly where it was, the pitcher hovering. My father suddenly found something urgent to say to the man beside him, leaning in close, his shoulders drawn up around his ears. Cassidy went very quiet beside me, and I did the thing I've done my entire life in that family, the thing I'm least proud of and most practiced at. I smiled, and I said it was wonderful, that the light really was beautiful in the mornings. I have no idea, to this day, where that sentence came came from, except that some old, well-worn instinct in me understood, before my conscious mind caught up, that whatever was happening at that table, it wasn't going to be solved by making my 83-year-old grandmother's anniversary dinner about it. My grandmother beamed, satisfied, and turned back to her plate, entirely unaware of the 4 separate people at that table now working very hard to look normal. I excused myself to the bathroom 4 minutes later, and sat in a locked store with my phone, hands shaking slightly, and typed 14 Birchwood Lane into a real estate search app, because some part of me already suspected the address existed even if the house never had, for me. It existed. The listing history was right there on the screen, a modest 3-bedroom colonial, sold 6 years earlier, the exact same month my grandmother had first called me into that sunroom with yellow curtains. Nothing had fallen through. Nothing had ever been delayed by financing, or title problems, or a difficult seller. A house had been purchased, on schedule, using my grandmother's money, meant for me, and I had never once been told it existed. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning with my laptop open, doing the kind of careful, methodical digging that 12 years of reading medical charts had trained into me without my ever intending it for this purpose. The county property records were public, and it took less than 20 minutes to find the deed. The house wasn't in my name. It wasn't in my grandmother's name either, not anymore. It was held by an entity called Whitmore Family Holdings LLC, formed the same month the property closed, 6 years earlier. I sat back in my chair, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very clear at the same time. I pulled the LLC's state filing the next morning before my shift, standing in the clinic parking lot with my badge already clipped to my scrubs. The registered members were listed plainly, no ambiguity, no shell layers to dig through. My mother, Denise Whitmore. My father, Roy Whitmore. Nobody else. Not my grandmother, whose money had bought the house. Not me, the person it was supposedly bought for. Just the 2 people who'd told me, 6 years earlier, to let the grown-ups sort it out. I called my closest friend from nursing school, Priyanka, who'd married a real estate attorney, and asked if I could buy her husband Dev an hour of his time disguised as a beer. We met at a quiet bar near his office instead, and I slid my laptop across the table before he'd even finished ordering. He looked over what I'd already found, scrolling slowly, his expression shifting from polite interest to something more focused. Okay, he said finally, an LLC structure like this usually exists for one of 2 reasons: tax planning, done properly and disclosed to everyone involved, or a way to hold an asset while keeping its actual income and control quietly separated from the person who's supposed to benefit from it. He looked up at me. Any idea whether the house has ever generated income? I told him I had no idea it had even existed until 4 days earlier. He set his glass down slowly and said, carefully, that if I wanted, he could pull the rental licensing records for the county, since landlords are required to register. It took him less than a day. He called me himself, skipping the pleasantries. It's been registered as a rental since 8 months after it was purchased, he said. Current listed rent, $2,380 a month. I did the math sitting in Dev's office 2 days later, the kind of math I'm good at, the same steady, patient arithmetic I use to track a patient's slow recovery week over week. Roughly 5 years of rental income, adjusted for a couple of modest increases over time. It came to well over $100,000, flowing into an account I'd never seen, never been told about, and never once benefited from, while I spent those same 5 years paying rising rent on a 1-bedroom apartment with a parking spot I genuinely once argued with a neighbor over. I didn't confront anyone right away. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. I am the daughter in my family who doesn't make scenes, the one who smooths things over, the one who said the house was wonderful within 4 seconds of learning it existed rather than say a single uncomfortable word at my grandmother's anniversary dinner. Confrontation has never been a language I speak fluently, so instead, for the next several weeks, I gathered, quietly, methodically, the same way I chart a patient's progress, before I ever recommend a change in their treatment plan. Priyanka was the one who kept me steady during those weeks, showing up at my apartment some evenings with takeout and no expectation that I'd talk about any of it if I didn't want to. just sitting with me while I stared at spreadsheets I'd built to track everything Dev was finding. "You don't have to have a plan yet," she told me one night, watching me delete and rewrite the same email to my mother for the 4th time. "You're allowed to just know things for a while before you decide what to do with them." I didn't fully believe her at the time, some part of me convinced that gathering evidence without immediately acting on it made me complicit in my own way. Looking back, I think she was right, and I think the patience she talked me into is a large part of why, when I finally did confront my family, I had something far more solid than a hurt feeling to bring with me. The next piece came from an unexpected direction, my sister Cassidy. 3 weeks later, over coffee at the same cafe we'd been meeting at since college, complaining lightly about wedding expenses, how grateful she was that the house money had covered part of her venue deposit when things got tight last spring. She said it so casually, stirring sugar into her latte, that it took me a full second to register what she'd actually said. I kept my voice completely level and asked her what she meant by house money. She looked at me for a second too long before answering, the specific pause of someone realizing, in real time, that she said something she wasn't supposed to say. "Birchwood," she said slowly, setting her spoon down. "You know, the rental. Mom and Dad said it made sense to help me out since you never really needed it the way I did." I asked her, quietly, keeping my hands still around my own cup so she wouldn't see them shaking, how long she'd known about it. She looked down at her coffee. "A couple years, I guess. I just figured you knew too, and didn't care that much." I did not, in that moment, tell her I hadn't known at all. I let her keep talking, the way you let a patient keep talking when they're about to tell you something important without realizing it yet. She told me, without any further prompting, that she'd received a little over $8,000 from the house account over the past 2 years. Help with the wedding, help with the car repair once, small enough amounts each time, that she'd apparently never thought to question the source too closely. $8,000, quietly funneled to my sister from a house purchased with my grandmother's money and meant, explicitly, for me. I want to pause here and tell you something about my grandmother that becomes important later. Iris Whitmore was not, and is not, a confused or easily managed woman, whatever my parents may have assumed or hoped. She ran a small accounting practice for 30 years before retiring, kept meticulous records of everything in her own life, and has a memory sharper than most people half her age. It was through her longtime home health aide, a warm, careful woman named Odalise, who'd been with her for 2 years by then, that I learned my grandmother's health scare 6 years earlier had actually been more serious than the family ever fully discussed at the time. Odalise told me one afternoon, while I sat with my grandmother during a nap, keeping her voice low in the hallway outside the bedroom door, that the fall itself hadn't been the real concern. It was the cardiac event discovered afterward, during the hospital workup, that had genuinely frightened Iris's doctors, a warning sign about how much time she might reasonably expect that the family had, at the time, agreed among themselves not to dwell on out loud, the way families sometimes decide collectively to soften a hard fact for everyone's sake, including their own. "She never told most of you how serious it really was," Odalise said. "But she told me, once, because I asked her directly why she suddenly wanted everything with the house handled so quickly. Iris had made the decision to buy that house specifically because she was afraid she might not live to see me settled otherwise, that it wasn't simply generosity, it was urgency, a woman trying to make sure one particular wish came true while she still had the chance to see it happen." Learning that didn't just make me angrier. It made the entire 6 years feel like something closer to theft of a dying woman's specific, deliberate intention, one that, as it happened, she was still very much alive to have honored properly. I sat in my car in her driveway for 20 minutes after that conversation with Odalise, not ready to go inside and act normal, running through 6 years of missed birthdays where my grandmother had smiled and asked how the house was treating me, and I had smiled back. And neither of us had known we were talking about two completely different realities the entire time. Dev helped me request the full closing file on the property, standard paperwork any co-owner or beneficiary can typically access, with the right documentation, and buried in that file was something that stopped me cold in his office for the second time in a month. A power of attorney document, dated the same month the house closed, purportedly signed by me, granting my parents authority to manage the property on my behalf indefinitely. I stared at that signature for a long time. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even a particularly close forgery, the letters too rounded, my actual signature far more slanted and rushed, the kind of thing only someone who'd genuinely studied how I sign my name would ever catch, which meant, somewhat sickeningly, that whoever forged it either hadn't tried very hard or hadn't expected anyone to ever look closely enough to notice. Dev's face changed when he saw it, the easy, sympathetic expression from our earlier conversations replaced by something more careful and professional. Leah, he said, I need you to understand what this document actually did. It wasn't just used to manage a rental. A power of attorney like this can authorize a lot more than collecting rent checks. He pulled the property's full lien history while I sat there, and there it was. A home equity line of credit taken out against the house 2 years after it was purchased. Current balance a little over $61,000. Secured using that same forged authorization. I asked him, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, what $61,000 against a house I didn't even know I half-owned could possibly have gone toward. It took another round of records requests, bank statement subpoenas. Dev walked me through step by step over the following weeks, patient in a way I didn't deserve given how little I understood about any of this going in, explaining terms like disbursement schedule and lien priority as though I hadn't spent 12 years learning an entirely different specialized vocabulary of my own. Each new document arrived like another small excavation, a transfer here, a wire there, until a pattern finally surfaced clearly. The Helic funds hadn't gone toward home improvements, hadn't gone toward any family emergency anyone had ever mentioned to me. They'd gone, almost entirely, in a series of transfers over 18 months, into my father's auto shop, propping up a business that had, apparently, been quietly failing for years behind a storefront that always looked, to the rest of us, exactly the same as it always had, the same faded red sign, the same bell over the door I'd walked through 100 times as a kid without ever once suspecting what was actually happening behind the counter. I sat with that discovery longer than any of the others, because here is the uncomfortable truth this story asked me to hold. My father hadn't simply stolen a house out of greed, in the flat, simple way I might have preferred to believe. He'd redirected his own mother's dying wish to quietly save a business he was too proud, or too frightened, to admit was collapsing, using his daughter's future as the collateral nobody had ever agreed to put up. Odalise, without ever fully understanding the legal weight of what she was doing, mentioned one afternoon that Iris kept a small fireproof box in the back of her closet, old documents, she called the important things, and that she'd once seen a letter in there with my name on it. I asked my grandmother directly, gently, whether I could look through some of her old papers with her, framing it as wanting to preserve her important documents properly, which wasn't entirely a lie. We spent an afternoon going through that fireproof box together, her narrating each item as we went, old insurance policies, my grandfather's discharge papers from the Navy, a stack of photographs bound with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. Near the bottom, in an envelope that had clearly been sealed and reopened only once, was a handwritten letter in her careful, accountant's cursive, dated the same week as our conversation, in the sunroom 6 years earlier. She read it slowly, her lips moving faintly the way they do when she reads anything closely now, her reading glasses slipping slightly down her nose. It stated, plainly and without any ambiguity, that she was gifting the property at 14 Birchwood Lane to me, Leah Marie Whitmore, unconditionally, as her sole intention, witnessed and signed by a notary whose stamp was still perfectly legible at the bottom of the page. When she finished, she set the letter down carefully on her lap, smoothing it once with her palm, and looked up at me. This isn't how it went, is it? She said, very quietly. It wasn't a question, not really. It was a woman finally hearing her own long-ago certainty confirmed out loud, in her own handwriting, after 6 years of believing something else entirely had simply gone wrong through no one's fault. I confronted my mother first, alone, over coffee at her kitchen table, the same table I'd eaten breakfast at my entire childhood, the same chipped mug I'd used since I was 12 set in front of me out of pure habit. I laid out what I knew carefully, the LLC filing, the rental income, Cassidy's $8,000, the forged authorization, the Helic funding my father's shop, watching her face the whole time. My mother's face went through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something defensive and brittle. We were protecting you, she said, her voice rising slightly. You were 26, Leah. You'd never managed anything that size, and we didn't want you making some impulsive decision and losing everything your grandmother worked to give you. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, how forging my signature, and collecting 5 years of rent. I never saw a dollar of qualified as protection. It wasn't forged, she said quickly, too quickly. Your father just signed for you because it was easier. I told her that wasn't how signatures work, that a document with my name on it that I never wrote has a specific legal word, and it isn't easier. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked down at her own hands instead, the same gesture Cassidy had made weeks earlier over coffee, and said nothing at all for a long moment, the kitchen clock ticking loudly in the silence. Dev helped me quietly reach out to the current tenant, a woman named Marisol, who I learned, to my genuine surprise, was someone from my parents' church, a friend of the family in the loosest, most informal sense, who had always believed she was renting through some vague arrangement with the Whitmores, and had no idea an entire ownership structure had been built around her lease without the actual intended owner's knowledge. She was, understandably, alarmed when Dev's letter arrived, worried she was about to be evicted or caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with her, calling his office twice in one afternoon before he could get her on the phone to explain calmly what was actually happening. I called her myself before things went any further, and told her plainly that nothing about her lease needed to change, that whatever had happened, it wasn't her fault, and that I had no intention of disrupting her family's home over my own family's dishonesty. There was a long silence on her end of the line, and then she said, quietly, I always wondered why nobody from your family ever came by to check on the place. Not once, in 5 years. I used to think that was strange. I told her I understood exactly why now, and that I was sorry it had taken this long for either of us to know the full truth of our own situation. It was Cassidy, in the end, who broke the story open in a way I hadn't planned or asked for. Guilt, apparently, had been sitting heavier on her than she'd let on in our coffee conversation weeks earlier, and rather than wait for me to decide how or when to tell our grandmother everything, she drove to Iris's house on her own one evening and told her the whole thing herself, the rental income, her own $8,000, all of it, crying, according to Odalise, who was there for part of it. Harder than anyone had seen her cry since our grandfather's funeral. I found out only after the fact, a call from Odalise telling me gently that Iris knew everything now, and that she wanted to see me the next morning. My grandmother's response, when I arrived, wasn't the tearful, devastated reaction I'd braced myself for the entire drive over. She was sitting very upright in her usual chair by the yellow curtains, a legal pad on her lap with notes already written in her precise handwriting. 3 separate columns I recognized instantly as the same organizational habit she'd used in her accounting practice for 30 years. She told me, in the same steady voice she'd used with clients for decades, that she'd already called her estate attorney that morning, before I'd even had my coffee. I'm not interested in a family shouting match, Leah, she said, tapping the legal pad once with her pen. I raised your father better than this, and I intend to find out exactly how much better, but that's a separate conversation from what needs to happen to the house. She wasn't interested in punishment for its own sake, she told me, though I could hear, underneath the calm, exactly how deeply this had wounded her. She was interested in correcting a mistake with exactly the same tools that had allowed it to happen in the first place, paperwork, filed properly, by people who actually told the truth on it. I built a career on the idea that the numbers don't lie even when people do, she said. Let's go make the numbers tell the truth again. Over the following months, working alongside Dev and my grandmother's own attorney, the LLC was formally dissolved, and a quiet title action corrected the deed to reflect what should have happened 6 years earlier, full ownership transferred directly to me, no conditions, no intermediary entity standing between my grandmother's intention and its outcome. The outstanding HELOC balance became my parents' personal financial responsibility to repay, negotiated as part of the settlement rather than fought over in a courtroom neither of us actually wanted to sit in for months. My grandmother, separately and entirely on her own initiative, restructured her remaining estate plans, a decision her attorney confirmed she'd made with complete clarity, and none of the confusion my parents had once, apparently, hoped a judge might eventually find convenient to believe about her. I didn't evict Marisol. That was never something I considered, even briefly. We sat down together, the two of us, and worked out a fair, transparent lease directly between us, at a rent she could actually afford long-term rather than whatever number had been quietly set to maximize a hidden income stream. She cried a little when we signed it, told me she'd always felt uneasy about the arrangement without being able to say exactly why, some instinct telling her the whole thing didn't quite sit right, and I understood that feeling better than almost anyone could have. My relationship with my parents remains complicated in ways I don't expect a single dinner conversation or legal settlement to resolve. My father, to his credit, the one time we spoke directly about it, didn't try to minimize what he'd done the way my mother initially had. We sat in a diner booth neither of us finished our coffee in, the vinyl seat cracked under my arm, and for a long time, he just turned his mug slowly in a circle on the table without drinking from it. I told myself for years it was temporary, he finally said, not quite looking at me, that I'd pay it all back once the shop stabilized. Every year I told myself that, and every year something else came up, and somewhere along the way the lie just became easier to keep living inside than to walk back out of. I asked him if he'd ever once considered just telling me the truth at any point in 6 years. Even a bad version of it. He was quiet for a long moment. Every single day, he said, I just never found a day that felt like the right one. And then your grandmother asked about the light in that bedroom, and I understood there wasn't going to be a right day. There was just going to be the day it came out anyway. I don't know yet what our relationship becomes from here. I know it's different than it was 6 years ago, when I still assumed every explanation he gave me was automatically true. Cassidy and I are rebuilding something, slowly, in the specific way you rebuild trust with someone who ultimately told a hard truth at real cost to herself, even if she should have told it years earlier. She paid back the $8,000 in full, on her own, without my ever asking her to. Small monthly transfers that started the same week. She confessed everything to our grandmother. I moved into the house on Birchwood Lane 8 months ago. Once Marisol's original lease naturally came up for renewal and she chose, on her own, to move somewhere closer to her new job. I remember standing in the empty living room on moving day, boxes stacked around me, sunlight coming through windows nobody had ever properly shown me before, and feeling a strange mix of grief and arrival at the same time. The way you feel finishing something that took far longer than it should have. I stood in that back bedroom my grandmother had asked about at the anniversary dinner, watching the morning light come through exactly the way she'd remembered it from listing photos she'd apparently studied more carefully than any of us realized. 6 years earlier, imagining a life for me she was determined to make real. I called her that first night, sitting on the floor of my new bedroom with a takeout container balanced on my knees, no furniture yet, and told her the light was every bit as good as she remembered. This time, I meant every word of it. It took her longer than she ever intended. It happened anyway. If there's a version of this story living quietly in your own family, a promise that seemed to simply fall through, an explanation you accepted a little too easily, because the alternative felt unthinkable, I hope tonight is what finally makes you look a little closer. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments. And if you're the kind of person who believes truth and patience eventually win out over quiet dishonesty, stay close, because Sweet Payback Stories has another one waiting for you very soon.